Okay. It's been a while, right? It's been like 5 months. I'm sorry about that. We
Yeah.
missed a month this summer where I was feeling swamped, and then we had the conference, and then John Arthos is now running weekend hermeneutics discussions. And so we decided to alternate weekends. And so he's doing September, we're doing October, he's doing November. We'll be back in December. But welcome back, everyone. I'm glad you could make
Okay.
it. We've
Excellent.
got a great reading today. This was actually suggested by Niall. Right
Oh,
now. Do you want to start off by saying why this interested you and what's in the background that made you think we really should discuss this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I suggested it some time back, so let me
Yeah.
let me jog my own memory. I think it was specifically that late essay, which seems to say a little bit more about pre-linguistic, co-linguistic, translinguistic,
mhm.
as it pertains perhaps to that idea of linguisticality as this broader, distinct term from language in Gadamer's later philosophy. So I think it says a lot about translation. It says not a lot. It says something about translation. Um, Interesting comparison between speaking and laughing. I thought was quite a curious topic. Maybe a little bit underdeveloped. I don't know if it's all that convincing, that distinction. And then that distinction between human animal and non-human animal is quite present. So I think there was a lot of things specifically around those three, pre, co, and trans. I think
Okay.
were
So the
interesting.
ways he talks about the boundaries or limits of language, language and laughter. And what was the third one again? Language animals. That's right.
Yeah, human and non-human animal
Right.
distinction, I guess, around the issue of laughing and Aristotle, the citation of Aristotle.
Right. Great. And
Um,
it is, I mean, it's a late talk, so you can be sure that most of these late talks, nothing's going to be too developed. We're getting lots of things
right.
put on the table, but there isn't the sort of deep dive that you might get in
Mm-hmm.
in early writing. So is there one of those things, or is there something else? This is that for those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is my traditional starting point. Is there anything you just are so anxious to get to? It would be antsy if you'd be antsy if we sat there waiting to get to the part you really wanted to discuss. This is your chance to put it on the table at the start. You can either physically raise your hand. I'll try to scroll through.
Well, I'll put
Okay.
something on the table. Okay.
Lorenzo too. Okay.
I'm terrible. I mean, the teacher asks if you want to say something, and I always put my hand up and say something. Okay. But so, you know, uh, I was trying to think about the title. And in the first paragraph, he says he's just really eager to talk about this. So it seems to be something important to Gadamer. It seems to be something important to his way of thinking about language. And then as he goes on, he sort of gets around and says, Niall said, to the distinctions between the pre-linguistic, animal talk, co-linguistic laughter, translinguistic.
Mhm.
And on the last page, he lists, by my count, if I got it right, five different boundaries of translinguistic, Uh, and I looked at all of this and I really don't feel confident that I understand what boundary means. What is boundary? What is a boundary of language? So just that idea, I really need help with.
That seems like I mean, it's the first word in the whole thing, right? So I think Brenda, I think we can. That seems like what better place to start than that? Yeah, Jim Risser, join us.
Yeah, I had an initial comment before responding to Don, which is it's interesting that he wants to talk about the boundaries or limits of language. In fact, maybe limits would have been a better translation.
Mhm.
Um, but against the background that going back to Vadimo's critique about being that can be understood as language, about everything is language, and Gadamer talks about the infinity, the openness of language as if language is everything. So here he is, in a way, not contradicting it, that's too strong, but giving a better perspective of, I think, of what he's always maintained about language. So talking about the limits now that he didn't do, let's say, in Truth and Method. This is interesting just for that reason alone. But to respond specifically to Don's comment or question then, if you think of this, in German, Grenze is both boundary and limits, and Heidegger talks about this. It's and even Jaspers, the boundary situation, Jaspers has, I think, this same sense. You could say it's that from which something begins, but I mean, it's more or less just simply a demarcation point that carves out a limit in an ordinary sense of limit, not a complete stop or an absolute stop, but just a limit in the sense that it becomes then a place to see something. At the boundary, you can't go across going across the boundary is opening up a different territory. So I just think of it in the ordinary sense, but I would stress the idea of limit rather than boundary, which creates too much of a spatial sense.
Right. And limit has this connection then to Jaspers and Heidegger, who also talk about limits, also not in that sort of hard spatial sense. Done? Is that progress?
Yeah, that's progress. I mean, I was trying to get a boundary is a place where two things come together and they're distinct, but they're in contact.
Mhm.
So is he thinking of limits as these boundaries as demarcating something outside language, or is it something, or is a limit found from inside language, that should get there? I mean, I think about I'm always thinking that Gadamer always has some Greek word in mind, I think, almost always. So paras, the boundaries or the apeiron, the unbounded, the infinite, is this what he's thinking about? Because what's bounded is determined. And that's what definition does. Definition bounds something, it sets boundaries for something. Can you define language? Can you not define language? I mean, uh, all of these kind of confusing thoughts were rattling around with me.
Sure. Because Grenz also means borders, and that has the idea of one thing ends and
Borders.
something else starts rather than some sort of
Yeah,
fixed end to things.
yeah.
Lorenzo, did you want to get in on this topic?
Well, yeah, but originally you were asking what topics do I want us
Right.
to address at some point. But
Yeah.
on this one, I think what Jim was saying is helpful. I mean, it's like the idea of the boundary here is like a demarcation, but it's not a boundary of the not and the is. But for example, when he talks about prosody, it's a not yet. It's not, I mean, because prosody is still part of language, but prosody in and of itself is not yet language in the semantic sense,
Mhm.
it seems to me. Um, but the one thing I did want us to talk about is the last page when he talks about, for example, linguistic competence. So my view is that what he's saying there just seems a little garbled, and so I want us to to uh, uh, take that up at some point.
Okay. I'll make sure that's on the list, Lorenzo.
Yeah, right.
How about more on this topic of how to understand Grenza? Yes, Niall.
Um, to go back to what Jim said, I think there is a passage that you find in Poetry, Language, and Thought, Heidegger's Poetry, Language, and Thought, in which he says Grenz is not a limit in that sense. It's not a limit, but it's that from which something begins rather than that from which something meets its limit. So it's more about the unfolding of a beginning of something rather than straining against the limits or even running up against the limits in that Wittgensteinian sense. So I think it's this language as limit, and he uses the language bone reference in this text as well, doesn't he? Isn't that right? He refers to language bone in the text, and bone would be something rigid, right? But at the same time, it's enabling limit. So the limit both delimits and enables the beginning of something. So I think that's the paradox. I think that's what Gadamer's thinking of. Really, the paradox is that from which we start, rather than that which we meet in our ending or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah, I like that. There isn't necessarily that, you see a boundary and the first thing that crosses your mind is, I want to go across it. What's on the other
Right.
side? And
Mm.
even these terms he uses, pre-linguistic, co-linguistic, translinguistic,
Trans.
all have linguistic in them. I mean, he says at one point about prosody that everything pre-linguistic is on the way to the linguistic,
Yeah.
and the
Yes.
translinguistic is something. It's a boundary. He talked about it, a boundary
Mm.
in the statement. I
Mm.
mean, I really to take up this issue of linguistic competence. It seemed to me what he was saying there, or pointing to there, and he's thinking of Chomsky and people like that, is that language is not a set of rules.
Mm.
It's not a set of rules you can learn and apply. It is something else. And Chomsky refers to Humboldt as this kind of dynamic. Okay? And I think this goes back to what he said about children. In a sense, our phrases are misleading. We talk about acquiring a language or learning a language, but a language is not something you learn the way you learn a technique, the way you learn an art. Okay.
Mm.
And he has this, and it's not an instrument, it's not a tool that you learn to use. He has this wonderful phrase about the baby, about kids, that that they don't really learn a language, they become a communicative being, which is something quite different. He doesn't elaborate that, but I think it's a wonderful statement, and one that is very thought provoking. Okay, so what's the difference between learning a language, the conception of a language as something you can learn, and becoming a communicative being? Yeah.
Before we head down that path, because I think we've got a good half hour on topics of language acquisition and linguistic competence. Brett, do you mind if
Mhm.
I you put a question in the comments related to the border thing? Would you be up for sharing that with all of us?
Oh yeah, sure.
Thanks.
So I was just wondering, like, when we're discussing these ideas of boundaries, are these boundaries that are demarcated in the objective sense of, what exists in reality, or or is he describing it more in the sense of what is pragmatically possible? Whether that's communicating in the scientific literature or uh, connecting between two translations or understandings of something.
Yeah. I think it makes sense. Is this something, an objective fact about the nature of language, or is this something about the way the language is used in communication in the sciences? Is that fair?
Yeah, and it was referenced earlier, like, is that boundary being approached from within the inside? So it's the limits of what we can perceive or possibly know, or is it demarcating out, what is not language?
Right. Yeah, that was one of the ways that Don talked about that. Yeah, thoughts about that. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, my first thought is, and thank Don for raising such good questions to start. Um, I think it's both, because he wants to talk about pre-linguistic experience. That gets back to my earlier comment. Not everything is language, but also it's within language. If I'm addressing your question, right? On the second last page, he talks about the limit of language is by virtue of our temporality, but then he adds in our discursivity. Now, what he's saying there, it reminds me of Hegel, that every time we speak, it's always a one-sided abstraction because it's always by necessity a limit. When you say something about something, you don't say it all. So every time we speak, we're in a condition of a limit of something one-sided, of something partial. So you can think of limit in that Hegelian way. I'll leave the question of our temporality for later discussion, but that complicates my remarks considerably, I would say.
Yeah, good. Does that help a little bit, Brett?
Yeah,
Um,
certainly. Yeah, we'll dive into the weeds here as we get further in.
Okay. I think Niall has some weeds for us.
I was wondering if the within and the without is an appropriate way of thinking about the limit question. So if we were always this lingual being and we're being with other people, then in some way there is nothing outside language in the richest sense of linguisticality and nothing outside the world. So we're already outside in the world. So this idea is a limit, something that's imposed. So I think what he's trying not to say is that limit means that grenze means constraint. I think that's what a limit is not. So a limit is not something that constrains us, but it's a beginning point. It's kind of the foray into something. Um, so I just think I don't know the way you put it there, pragmatic constraints, or is it what we're trying to say? I think language itself is giving itself as some sort of delimiting, not tool, because he says it's not a tool, but um, an organ of a lived organ of human existence, something like that. That's hard to distinguish from human existence. So I have this difficulty because Jim just said there that not everything is language. So that goes back to being, which can be understood as language in the whole history of two commas with Vatimo. Well, but is everything that he's talking about pre, co, trans contained under the category of Sprachlichkeit, not language? I would say the co, the trans, and the third one, what is the co, the trans, and the mit, is all part of linguisticality. So in that sense, there is nothing outside of linguisticality. So even the pre-linguistic belongs. Gesture, for example, he seems to say gestures are already quasi-lingual. Would you agree? Am I wrong in thinking that?
Yes, Jim. Yeah, go ahead, Jim. You got to unmute yourself, though. There you are.
I have a new version of Zoom, and I can't even find the raise the hand thing anymore. I just started to say that Niall is always so persuasive when he speaks. But Gadamer does say, and I understand that difference, and I think highlighting the idea of Sprachlichkeit is always so important when trying to talk about Gadamer and language. But there are several places where he does say not everything is linguistic, and I think I'd have to check the German, but I wonder if he's even saying sprachlich in some fashion. So he mentions like love at one place. I forget where that passage is now. You seem to know you seem to know the passage in Gadamer better than I do. But he'll talk about love and things that are closer to the affective side of life. That I'm trying to hesitate. Maybe I want to try to say too much in one thing. That is, I almost want to take back now what I'm saying, because even something like something of sense, it's related to intention and the potential of meaning. So a sensation. But I think Gadamer is holding to something like, please, I want to say our world is fundamentally linguistic, but there are some things that are just slightly, let's not put them there so immediately. So if we could find that passage and see if that fits yet with what you're saying now, I just can't remember exactly where it's at about love and other things not being linguistic.
I think morality is mentioned. Am I correct? He refers to gesture, even morality, I think, in this text.
Yeah, I don't. He does use sprachlich, but never uses sprachlichkeit in the text. Yeah, Lorenzo.
Yeah, I can't find the hand waving icon either.
Okay, that's fine. I'll keep an eye out for you.
Yeah, I do think that there's an operational sense of language that's employed here. It's saying that it's the ability to place something which is not present before myself and you. Place something that is not present before us. It seems to me that's the operational notion of language he's working with. So I think that would exclude prosody and perhaps gestural communication from language in this full operational sense. I do think that's, and in this sense, this is pretty much a repetition of what he said back in the 60s in the Man and Language essay that was in that collection, Philosophical Hermeneutics. So I do think that's still operative here for him. I don't think he's going back on that. Yeah, that's all I want to say. Yeah.
And that's what he highlights when he turns back to Aristotle.
Yes.
Orwell
Yeah.
says, here's what makes humans different from other animals.
Right.
We can point to things in the future. We can point
Right.
to things that aren't present to us.
Which are not present. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the temporality part too that
Right. Right.
points us to that we're going to have to take up as well.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to. I mean, I think his journey to Aristotle, he gives a wonderful philosophical reading of Aristotle. So it's philologically right, but he's really bringing out the essential constituents, so to speak, of language as Aristotle presents them. Okay, uh, the issue of boundaries, sort of, and borders, limits. Okay, uh, I think of a passage I don't understand in the physics where Aristotle talks about the infinite. And it says if you talk about the world, the natural historians need to understand the infinite. Is the world infinite or not? And his answer is it isn't. And there, I think what Jim said, the Hegelian kind of perspective, that if you say something, you have to say something. And when you do that, you impose a border, a boundary on what you're saying. Okay. But that doesn't prevent you from going back and saying something else or saying something more, so that he actually will say at one point that the capacity of language constantly to absorb our experience means that language is unbounded. He actually uses the unbegrenzt, unbounded. Okay, in that sense, it's unbounded. Yeah, but that's just one remark he makes in passing. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Ole.
Uh, just want to make a remark on Nail's problem of the universality of linguisticality, and secondly, a second remark on Gadamer's somewhat selective presentation of Aristotle. Concerning this universality of linguisticality, I would say, or I would agree to what Neil is saying, to the extent that we can articulate anything at all through our capacity to language, but that doesn't imply that everything we have some access to must be somehow submerged in linguisticality. For example, the experience of artworks. That's similar to the affective dimension of our life. Jim mentioned before. These are, I think, two obvious fields where our expressive, our articulation capacities are not strong enough to catch what we want to express in our emotions, at least sometimes, or in our affections, or in the experiences of very individual phenomena like works of art. There we have the strange experience that we would like to articulate something, but our linguistic expressions are not adequate for that purpose. That's, by the way, a point also to Don Marshall's question, whether the boundary is something that demarcates us from a field dimension or not. And concerning the presentation of Aristotle, it's very interesting that Gadamer Gadamer simply puts aside the question of truth, which is of course connected to his treatment of the proposition as a limited orientation of European philosophy. Of course, he's following Heidegger in this regard, but I mean, it's somehow a bit disturbing just to say about propositions or about the structure of propositions and what philosophy language could say about this, to say that they simply forget the pragmatic embeddedness of propositions and we should turn to this. So it's just interesting how Gadamer pushes these questions aside, and I'm really curious how do you see this presentation, whether you think it's a problem at all or it's unproblematic and so thanks.
Specifically, the way he just sort of dismisses a whole world of philosophical inquiry and insight by suggesting that the statement is just a limit case or an extreme case of language losing its way. All right, Eric, is your comment on that, or should I come back to you?
It's not on that directly. It's going back to Lorenzo.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Let's see if we can get a good answer to Ole on this one. You know, when Gadamer talks about the statement as an extreme case, a limit case of treating language as statements that just sort of he suggests they just sort of float independently of their pragmatic context. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, what I have to say might actually indirectly come back to that. So
okay, go for it.
When Lorenzo, you found that the statement that Gadamer says, like, heart of language is to make present what is absent. Is that Gadamer and I read it like a week ago, so I don't remember if that's Gadamer doing exegesis on Aristotle or if that's Gadamer saying a positive statement of his position. And if so, if that's Gadamer's position, even if it is through exegesis of Aristotle, is that a place where we can play with Don talking about, like, there's this boundedness, this boundary of, like, going with Dale, the pre-linguistic, co-linguistic, and translinguistic, that there's that boundary, but then the unboundedness of kind of the possibilities for what we can say, that there's like that boundary. And so going to the statement, it seems like the statement artificially undermines that capacity that we have to render what is absent present. So I guess that's all I have to say.
Okay. Ole, does that say much for you? I guess I find it fairly quick and dismissive. I think that, but I also understand why he's not engaging in that whole area of philosophy. It sounds like this was a conference dominated by scientists with a couple of philosophers. I tried to look at the table of contents from the proceedings, and so maybe he's emphasizing in this context. He always was sensitive to his audience, right? Maybe he's especially emphasizing in this context the importance of the pragmatic aspects of language, as what he sees as sort of a counter. But he certainly doesn't give. Go ahead, Ole. You can get in here.
You don't really find any further notice of let's say philosophy of language going into details concerning the structure of the statement proposition, neither in truth and method nor in in hermeneutics and semantics and so on. So, I mean, you can, of course, roughly say or follow that the basic idea here is that a statement or a proposition is a poor thing alone. It cannot be understood in an isolated manner. We always need a dialogic, real pragmatic situation if we want to understand precisely a proposition or a statement. So therefore, we don't really need to care theoretically for the structure of structure and function of statements and propositions. So I mean, you can of course put Gadamer's position in this way, and with that you are not far away from truth and method and later small papers. The question is how to connect this to usual discussions of philosophy of language, if we want to connect it to these discussions at all.
Yeah, that's true. Niall?
I was wondering if one way would be to talk about how, I mean, in keeping with Heidegger, there is this prejudice as prejudgment, right? So it's before you get to a proposition, before you get to the assertion, the thing which was defined as the locus of truth, he's trying to wrestle truth out of the proposition or the assertoric statement, and he's trying to bring it back into the dialogical, which he thinks has been forgotten. So yes, he's dismissive, but I guess he's trying to point us towards something earlier, might be the wrong word, but something distinct from propositional statements and their truthfulness.
They dismiss.
But the other thing I thought, to Ole's point, was connected to Gadamer does say that works of art have a type of propositional quality. He says that works of art state something. Now he might mean it in a figurative sense. He might not mean their judgment in that proper, but he does say they have an assertoric force. So that might be relevant to the discussion as well.
Just to make my point on concerning this more clear, the eighth volume of Gesammelte Werke has the title Kunst als Aussage, artwork as a statement, but that's of course a statement in a much broader sense than the propositional statement in philosophy of language, and the whole issue has to do with Gadamer's understanding of philosophy of art, where the artworks are primarily bearers of significance or meaning, and I mean that could also be disputed in other.
I think on some level, expressivity is this fundamental thing running through the entire essay. The definition of the play of expressivity, something along those lines, where expressivity refers to the pre-linguistic, expressivity refers to the co-linguistic, and expressivity refers to the translinguistic. And that's why I was wondering whether linguisticality is always the as yet unsaid of expressivity, right? Because he does mention on page 14 this movement. How does he put it? He talks about play, and he talks about play as bridging the gap between the not yet semantically articulated form of communication and word communication. So it's this moment of breaking the silence, where words can bring something into life, cross a certain boundary, open up a new beginning. And it's literally kind of this movement back and forth between the yet to be said and the already said. So I think expressivity might be one way into talking about linguisticality, that the possibility or the potential of expressivity, which would include, I would think, works of art then, not as non-linguistic things in one sense. If they express a force, then they are not without linguisticality, even if they are not speaking in a traditional way of understanding speaking.
Well, I thought the discussion of children was kind of charming here and very interesting. And he does talk about the baby and what happens before language. Okay, so one of the things that happens is the baby plays with its fingers. And this is already a kind of articulation, and it's babbling game with the mother. Okay, there's already something pointing to language, because there is a sense of dialogue. There's a sense of agreement. There's a sense of attunement to one another.
Mhm.
And it's this attunement to one another in a relation. I mean, he thinks of the playing with the fingers as like question and answer. And I think, wow, there's a sort of pre-question and answer. Okay. But at some point, the baby begins speaking words. Okay. And there he says, I thought this was wonderful on page 13. At some point, the meaningful word creations finally break free and become established. And here's where he says, this is a beginning without a beginning. And the point there is no first word in language. The language doesn't have a beginning. It didn't start somewhere.
Mhm.
The first word already implicates the whole of language. Okay. That's why you can't learn it. You don't learn it, you become a communicative being. Okay. But I thought this articulation is absolutely fundamental and is seen even before words emerge. Yeah.
Mhm. John Beach.
Yeah, very interesting discussion. Just wanted to defend Gadamer's um, view on the statement on the offenses, apophensis. And he using the example of the courtroom, where the witness is under the complete control of the questioner, of the person who is and he only gets to respond to the questions. There's no way you're going to really find out what the witness's point of view is or what his real opinion is in a court in a properly, it's designed to do that. It's designed to establish certain facts that the witness may be aware of what they're trying to establish, may not, but it's a very there's no real question and answer going on, as Don was saying, like we normally understand with the statement given in a legal thing. And of course, that's an extreme example, but I think it does indicate the limitations of even the scientific statement, the proposition, the analytic view that where all truth is contained, it either is the case or isn't the case. That's it. That's no. It's much more complex than that. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
I thought I might add, and I want to turn over to Don's point as to discussion about children and language acquisition. I just want to add that both John McDowell and Robert Brandom have written on Gadamer, so they may be figures as sort of Pittsburgh Hegelian tradition that become a way to connect Gadamer's views to debates in contemporary philosophy of language through their versions of semantics, inferential semantics, and so forth. But I'm not sure Gadamer himself does it, for better or worse. So yeah, what about what Don brought up, pointing us to the sections where Gadamer is talking about, living into a language rather than acquiring a language, and that process of language acquisition. Yes, Jim.
Ooh, I got my hand raised.
Nice job.
I don't know how I did it. But in any case,
I'll put it down for you.
maybe you did it. I thought Don's comment was astute. It's about when the child learns this, when the child learns that says its first word, that is not the beginning of language, but it's the beginning of the child learning to speak. To say it more precisely, he actually says that the child's is the first speaking, but the child is already in language. So the idea is about your before the beginning when he's referring to the arche. I'd rather say we're just simply born into a world that's languaged. So the child and the fetus or the child, depending on which political party in the United States you're from here, the fetus or the child in the womb is already hearing the voice of the mother. And so when the child enters the world, there's already speaking going on. So that's the sense that, in that sense, language proceeds, the child learning the child's first word. And that's why I think he also mentions gestures so early on that now referred to as well. So it's a curious kind of language world that is not yet the world of propositions. And what would complicate the discussion slightly, perhaps, is to then speak about the idea of the mother tongue that Gadamer refers to from time to time. So the mother tongue becomes that way that you think it's innate, you're born with a mother tongue. We all have that first language, so to speak. But it's curious how that mother tongue is also learned in a sense, not in the sense that we already were saying. We don't learn a language like it's an object to learn, as when we go to school and learn the syntax and grammar of a language. We're not learning that way. But we're being exposed to the speaking of the world and take up that. So in effect, we do, in a way, even learn our mother tongue, even though it's what is always first. So it's first, and it's not a complete first. So I don't know if that makes much sense to you.
Sure, it makes sense. And he talks about a foreign language as being another example of a limit for us, right? Another grenza is the language which is not our mother tongue. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Don, did you want to get back in here?
Well, I just, uh, since we raised the question of foreign language, what he says on 16, page 16, about foreign language as a boundary, so I had different reactions to it. At first, I thought, well, okay, now he's recognizing that you don't learn language, you learn a language. Yeah. But then it occurred to me that when he's talking about a foreign language here, he's talking about um, the sense in which whatever language you've learned, always it feels like the right way to say things. And different languages, then you're having learned that don't feel quite right. They just don't feel quite right. You think, well, that's not quite the right word for it. Okay. And that sense of the rightness of being within a world that is it's just this is the way it is. Okay. Uh, that's what he's talking about. And that is a feature of language itself. To have any language is to have a sense that this is the right way to say it. Yeah. And that's a very puzzling and profound kind of point. What is that feeling that this is the right way to say it? And everything else feels like a translation. Yeah, you're never completely at home in another language. Yeah.
So yes, Jim.
At one point, Gadamer, I forget who he quotes, but he says, every translation is a betrayal. And he's saying that because of this experience of the mother tongue. And there's always a certain limit, obviously, in every translation, precisely because of that mother tongue experience.
Right.
So I'm curious how this talk about the mother tongue and sort of finding the right way to say something, that experience fits with what he says at the end, where he says that there is always some more meant and something more intended than the words let us get out and that are received. So it seems like on one hand, it seems should be this familiar world that allows us to bring things to consciousness, even if they're not present, where we find just the right way to say something and it hits us. And the other end, he seems to describe this experience of always feeling like we've failed. We've always feel like, no, it didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. But yes,
Is it failure? I mean, I see exactly what you're saying, but I think this gets back to what Niall was saying earlier about Sprachlichkeit having the sense, and I didn't think of this before. I think, Niall, you're really onto something. Sprachlichkeit has the character of possibility. Think now of Aristotle and the whole idea of the relation between possibility and actuality. And of course, Gadamer wants to say that language is Vollzug, and the German Vollzug, I would say, translates the Greek energeia. It's an actualizing actuality.
Mhm.
So if that's the case, that not quite being able to say everything we want to say has this character of an actualizing actuality, and there's no telos except in that simple sense of when we're not dealing with the complexity of meaning, when it's more or less a simple, something can be understood and interpretation just drops away. I had one other thought on that. Oh, it goes back to, this goes back to Gadamer's responding to Derrida, and I think he uses the expression, the French word voir dire. And so in our wanting to say, and this even goes, I wish John Arthos was here. This even goes back to how he understands the inner word. So there's something about that intention to mean that can always go beyond itself. And that's that kind of incompleteness or related to potentiality and so on.
It's just a
Can I
question about that last point, and it is he mentions in that last paragraph psychoanalysis.
Mhm.
And I didn't quite see how that was connected to the question of all these of your language never quite expressing exactly what you mean, that you always mean more than you say. Is he thinking of Lacan or something? I mean, I was just, it's
I
just a
thought
very cryptic remark about psychoanalysis. Okay?
the way I read
Small
it,
point, but
the way I
you know,
read it is the way I thought that some talk therapy is supposed to work is as you put things forward and speak things, often the therapist can hear things in your words that you're not hearing, and the ways in which your language is maybe covering over what's really going on. So in a way that your words reveal things about yourself that you don't realize you're revealing as you speak. That's the way I took it. But other people may have a better idea of this. I know Niall's been waiting. Can we come back to that last?
I wanted to, yeah, Jim, I think Jim's point, I'm really curious about that because he says on page 14, so he starts referring to this term, uh, uh, the language of words. So by saying the language of words, he's clearly not reducing language to speaking in a sense of verbal utterances or something like that. So language has this, it extends beyond it. But in the same paragraph, he talks about language attaining completeness. So is the completeness the energeia, which is not a perfection? Because so there is no last word in the sense there is no perfect speaking, because if there were, it would be a final word and the conversation would end. But language can be complete without being perfect. Is that the implication where where completeness means full, right? It's the full word. It's the full dialogue that has both word and response. So language comes into its own fullness only when it's understood, not in terms of the proposition, but in terms of word and response to word. And that's never the last word. So fullness and wholeness or completeness does not imply any perfection or finished article or something.
Yes, I'll just to make this quick comment. That's in the whole meaning of the word Vollzug, when he says art is Vollzug. And that literally means to draw into fullness. And that's the whole idea of the actualizing actuality as a way to translate energeia, which I think is better in English.
Mm-hmm.
All right, John, let's get John Beach. He's been waiting, and then Lorenzo, you're up next.
Okay, just two real quick ones. Regarding the Don's question on the psychoanalysis, that threw me for a minute as well. And I think though normally when he mentions that, he's talking about the lack of the apodictic knowledge of self-consciousness. That he's associated with some context there that we got away from the idea that we really know what's in our minds, and that's a very important step in Heidegger and Gadamer and so on. And the other thing was regarding language has no beginning. There's a there's a place in Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols where he says, um, well, he says something close to this, but he says that um, like God, if there's any beginning, like God began language or something, or we can't get rid of the concept of God. But he also says it with being here too, because of language. It's in language, and when he says, indeed, nothing has so far had a more naive power to persuade than the error of being. For example, as it was formulated by the Eleatics. It has every word, every sentence left we speak on its side. Even the Eleatics' enemies succumb to the temptation of their concept of being Democritus, among others, when he invented his atom. And then reason in language. Oh, what a treacherous old hag. I fear we shall not get rid of God because we still believe in grammar. And this goes back to limitations in language as well, and limitations of grammar, which, and I'm quoting from the C&M translation of Nietzsche there. But Gadamer refers to this very loosely in the beginning of philosophy. In the first chapter, he said, we know about writing, but language, I mean, when does that begin? Nobody, and he refers to saying Nietzsche saying that was something that was created by God. And what was there's that one other little point. Oh yeah, no, I mentioned it. Okay, that's all I wanted to add.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, John. Okay, Lorenzo.
Yeah, I want to go back to this idea of our wanting to mean. That suggests that we operate with some notion of, let's say, being successful in meaning, and sort of wondering what would be the criterion of success when we want to mean. Is it that we have managed to make it present somehow, or is there something else? And I do think that, right, to have reached a sort of a complete understanding is not to have reached a final understanding. So I'm thinking about what Gadamer said about immanent text, and he's talking about literature, and that the text is that which demands interpretation. Once we've understood it, in most cases, Gadamer says, in most texts, once we've understood them, then their textuality evaporates. But the thing about literature, or immanent text, I guess, is that even after having been understood, even after having been interpreted, even if we think completely or successfully, their textuality remains. So they demand yet another interpretation. They're open to yet another interpretation. So there's nothing, that textuality doesn't evaporate. Anyhow, that's a bit of a side issue. But what is this idea of wanting to mean, and what's the criteria of success? I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question, Niall.
I think that's that's something that's never left me with Gadamer. I mean, what exactly makes a good conversation a good conversation?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say for me, my two stabs would be, the first one is that in speaking right, by bringing both the sayable and the unsayable into the world in some way, that something is brought to presence that isn't previously present. But the criteria of a successful conversation is hitting the mark, where hitting the mark means more of itself. So that whatever keeps that conversation, it's kind of almost a Davidsonian idea of like the successful conversation is the one that makes more conversation for itself. Right. So it's a strange criteria of success, though. But I think if you think about a good conversation, it's very often one that you don't control. It's not choreographed by yourself in advance. It has a life of its own, and it makes way for more of itself. something along those lines, and bringing the present and the absent into the world. Is that viable?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually thinking about Gadamer's reference to the fact that we're looking for the right word, right? And in this case, there's a wanting to mean by choosing the words I choose, and so they are the criterion of success. We're not unhappy with the words we've chosen after a conversation, but as we're talking, as we're sort of enunciating a phrase, a claim, we're already unhappy with the word we've chosen. And so I guess the question here is, what is it to be happy? Is it that we believe we brought forth that which we want to invoke, or not? I mean, I guess it's
you've reached the other, I think you would say. But it's the right word is the one that reaches that reaches the other. But maybe it means we've been understood, something along that line.
Yeah, how about you want to get in here?
Yeah. I just wanted to add to the question of Lorenzo that I think we should separate the problem of when a conversation is fruitful or interesting, and the problem whether I have any criteria for expressing myself in the way I wanted. And I suppose that the answer to the second problem, and so to Lorenzo's problem, is simply that we do not have clear internal criteria for comparing what we wanted to say with what we were saying, because that would presuppose that we have in an internal language what we want to say, which is clearly impossible in any useful sense in a Gadamerian framework. We have, of course, this soft criterion that we are roughly satisfied with the way we expressed ourselves, and sometimes we modify what we are saying. For example, with the formula to be more precise. If I reformulate my sentence with the interim phrase to be more precise, it clearly means that I have somehow the impression that I said more or less than I wanted to.
Yeah, Lorenzo, does that?
Well, yeah, I think I'm likely to say to be more precise when I already have the requisite resources for being more precise. But that's different from the feeling that I've not used the word that I wanted to use. There, I don't have the requisite resources for using that. If I did, I would have used that word. But I don't want. It's just what the reason I brought that up is that Charles Taylor, who's another philosopher influenced by Gadamer, makes a distinction within language between two sorts of success, what he calls practical success and linguistic success. Practical success is when I sort of say the sorts of things that enable me to bring about the changes in the world that I want. Linguistic success for him is more the matter of what Gadamer refers to as finding the right word. And so Taylor tries to work on a notion of what linguistic success means. And I'm asking, what does Gadamer mean by linguistic success in that sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Eric. Can you hear me, Eric?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, keep driving.
Yeah, if it's annoying for me to interject like this, just let me know. But for me, like responding to Lorenzo, your earlier formulation of the question, which is the wanting to mean and finding the right word, that to me it also connects back to this, making present what is absent, right? The finding the right word brings out what was absent in the domain of understanding, right? We're successfully understood, and that goes with what now you brought up, which is it reaches the other, right? But I want to go back to Don talking about the child or maybe it was John, bringing the child entering language or something like this, that instead of thinking of the right word as what successfully reaches the other, it's also when I'm understood by another person, it's like I get to come to present when I was absent from their domain of understanding, right? Like that just like the child now can participate in language and be understood not as a topic of discussion but as a discussion contributor. Right now they're present as a contributor, and I get to be present as a contrib, like, right, it brings me from the absence of, I'm not a voice, right? I'm thinking of Rissler's book, right? The voice. I become present as a voice. That's all.
All right. Thanks, Eric. And please don't gesture with two hands while you're moving. And keep one hand on the wheel. It makes me nervous. All right, Jim, would you want to get in there with that segue?
Yes. Well, that's a lot. Eric opened up a lot more, so I'll stay for now with Lorenzo's reframing of this question, which I understand better now with the reference to Taylor. I want to say, first of all, it has a sense of objectivity. I saw some of the language Cosmo was mentioning. I don't want us just to think of this right word as being simply an internal mechanism that is all about the condition of my subjectivity, working it out. Niall already pointed to, as we all know, the question of conversation is about the other speaking. So I'd rather emphasize a variation on that and say there's always a dimension of realism in Gadamer's hermeneutics. So in phenomenological terms, it's the Zaka. And so it's the matter that speaks that is, I would say, also makes an appearance. Something has come out, it's made an appearance. And I would use a variation of the words we've been using and say something, it fits. At one place in an essay, forget all these places Gadamer writes, you have to excuse my poor memory. But he talks about finding it's correct. It says it's right, it's correct. I don't like the word correct because that implies there's a measure for that, a measure that's identifiable. And I like the word fitting, that it fits together, saying, that's right. But that right comes from, so here's my answer to your question. That right comes actually from the side of the thing. My one way, I've mentioned this somewhere in my own writing, it goes back to Plato's seventh letter, when he talks about how the thing itself comes out. And in this conversation that tries its hardest, all of a sudden something springs up or springs out like a leap, like a flash. And so that's the idea. That's why I don't want to get us into another conversation, but that's his discussion of truth through the question of the beautiful and truth and method, because he treats the beautiful not as beauties in the eye of the beholder. We all know this, but as that Greek sense, it's tied to the appearance of reality. So when it's right, it comes out. He even uses that, and when he talks about reading, all of a sudden you say, oh, that's what it is. So it has come to appearance. And how can that be sensible to all of us trying to think this through when it sounds so elusive? But I'd say it's like that Platonic gesture. You try your damnedest, you think you have this discursivity, and all of a sudden it comes out. One last comment, not unlike a therapeutic conversation. You're sitting there trying to figure out, why am I acting this way, and so on. You have a conversation, you say, oh, well, it's this. And then you go, maybe, and you pause and the conversation continues and you say, oh, no, now I see. So that same gesture that someone could have in an ordinary conversation, but perhaps paradigmatically in a therapeutic conversation, they say, that's what it was. That's what it is. So you can't calculate that. And yet phenomenologically, it's very real. And no, that's as far as I can take it.
Mhm.
Good, thanks. Don, does that help with the talk about psychology and psychoanalysis in the last paragraph?
It does, and it reminds me that Freud does himself reflect on endless and unending and ending therapy. That in some sense, therapy is endless, okay, unendlich, okay? And in another sense, you stop at some point. Okay, so I think Jim is very right that the appropriate word has to be thought of in Gadamer's sense in relation to what it is that is coming to appearance and in relation to the other person. He says about Aristotle that really the core of Aristotle, this is on page 11, is syntheke, what gets translated as convention. But the culture inducing significance of this word lies in the transition from homo faber to animal politicum. Okay, through this expression, uh, language is designating communicating. That is, it's not from nature, it's based on agreement. It expresses the basic structure of linguistic understanding and linguistic communication. And those words are sprachliches Verstehen, so Verstehen, und sprachliche Verständigung, which is not only communication, but coming to agreement, mutual agreement. He then says, Übereinkommen, okay? But he doesn't want this misunderstood. So as it is very often, so on page 15, he says at the top that these conversations, the conversation never comes to an end. The dialogue never comes to an end because that would violate the individuality of the participants. Okay, and I think here at the end, he may be thinking of Maurice Blanchot, and Blanchot has a very typically Blanchot puzzling book called The Infinite Conversation, L'Entretien Infini. And his whole point is, and he's sort of trying to reply to, I think he's partly has Gadamer in his sights, there is never an end to a conversation. Agreement is never actually reached. It's not an actual point that's reached. Okay. But Gadamer is saying, I knew that. Okay. That's exactly what I thought. The conversation is endless. Okay. And yet you do have a sense that you did express yourself. That is, it's wrong to think of that in sheerly negative terms. Grammar is the limitation on what we say, but it is also the means by which we say speak. We couldn't speak without it. So yeah.
Okay, great. John Beach.
There we go. Yeah, I just a little cautious about going with psychoanalysis here in that sense, especially when we look at Gadamer's debate with Habermas on this very issue. That's one point. And which page is the reference to psychoanalysis made? I can't find it now.
It's the very last paragraph on page 17. He calls it the deepest of the
Okay.
problems that essentially inheres in the boundaries
Yes.
of language.
Yes. It's yeah. So I think this is like um, okay. I have the feeling that Gadamer says that everything, all the truth that we really know comes from language. We learn it from language. And the Greeks believed that. Aristotle believed that. And, you always look at how do you speak about it? And that was, Plato's famous turn to the logoi. And Aristotle's, search for the principles. It always has to do with we look at how we speak about it. And there's never any real experience or that is, I mean, that's just assumed as um, uh, yeah, okay, seek the correct word. Okay, I'm going back to 17 here. But yeah, the thing, yeah, anyway, that's okay. I've said I want to say. But that's like Habermas goes down that road where he talks about psychoanalysis as the bringing the truth out of talk. And Gadamer said, no, that's not quite right because somebody's in control here. It's not a real conversation. There's a direction. There's an external motivation that's going on here. So, okay.
Right.
So I'm pushing back on that.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Shaba.
I just want to give shortly support to what John Beach was saying. I was also perplexed by the reference to psychoanalysis, because if you remember in Truth and Method, psychoanalysis in parallel with historical approach represents a wrong attitude towards what the other wants to say. If we read what the other says, in the light of suspicion, to quote Paul Ricoeur's hermeneutics of suspicion, then it means that we don't take what he or she is saying seriously as potential truth. And in this sense, it is. So I'm not really sure whether this very slight reference to psychoanalysis should be taken seriously. Thanks.
Yeah, good. Yeah, Jim or sir.
I believe, yeah, I believe in Truth and Method. The reference to he says a therapeutic situation. I'm not sure he's explicitly asking about psychoanalysis. I actually ask him about that because I've taught in a therapeutic psychology program for over 30 years. And he was thinking of the Freudian psychoanalysis that does not engage in a genuine conversation. So it's always some will to mastery. So I grant that point, but I don't think he's not overtly appealing to what I understand what John Beach was saying. That is, Habermas is, in his early comments on Freud and so on, he's evoking some notion of the hermeneutics of suspicion, and that you need some kind of a suspicion to overcome ideological distortions and so on. I don't think he's referring, I think Gadamer is more general here in this text. He's just referring to the fact that something is hidden, something is undisclosed, and that meaning can come out. So I understand the difference in a very specific sense on what a psychoanalytic approach may be doing and the structure behind that. I think there's a simple gesture here of just talking about that experience where you're not sure what the meaning is, and the talk can help bring it out.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Niall.
I think it's not so much an interest in Lacan as an interest in using desire as a term of art when it comes to wanting to say, willing to say, wanting to hit the target, wanting to find the right word. Well, what is that drive that is in the human being to cross the boundary, right? So he seems to say that there are boundaries, and yet these boundaries are negotiable, that you can run up against the boundary, extend the boundary, but he's trying to explore what is that desire to hit the right mark, right? In that sense of the fitting, the appropriate interpretation. But I was curious about the reference to translation at this point. Could we talk about that? Because I was thinking, because you have this 3 or 4 terms, right? You have speaking, you have translating, you have reading, and you have, I don't know, listening, something like that, right? There are all of these terms, and all of them are striving, desiring to arrive somewhere at completeness, which is fullness, but not perfection. But when it comes to translation, then he seems to give a somewhat bland definition of a successful translation. And he says, on page 17, he says So he's talking about the extreme case of poetry. He seems to say that poetry has this particularity and foreignness to it. But he might be talking about the translation of poetry has this particularity and foreignness to it. But then he talks about translators. So from the last line on 16 up to 7, translators usually come to stand, exhausted, only halfway done, even if this does not concern the extreme case of poetry, so even translation in general. And then he defines it, it is just an infinite process to succeed in rebuilding the feeling and content of the foreign speaker into the feeling and content of one's own language. In some way, that seems a very un-Gadamerian thing to say. It's not about the feeling. It's not that sounds like it's missing the Zaka that Jim was talking to earlier, and it's simply about the sensation of the translator finding the right words that might represent the intent of the original text or something like that. And I wonder, where's the Zaka in that sense of the rebuilding the feeling and content of the foreign speaker in one's own language as the target of translation? So I don't know if I'm off in thinking that is un-Gadamerian or is it very Gadamerian. I don't know.
Would you, I mean, I realize for that passage, Gadamer says, we're not even talking about the extreme case of poetry, but would you agree that it's for poetry? Then not only do you have to translate the content, but you need to get something about the feel of the words, the feel of the words in their mouth, the rhythm of the words, the ways in which there might be rhymes are internal and so forth. So at least
yes, there's definitely there's definitely that technical aspect to it, David, I think for sure. But it's about poetry is in essence about untranslatability. And doesn't he say somewhere the best we can hope is another poet would come along and write a poem about that poem rather than translate it, something like that.
Yeah, of course. This is yes, Jim.
Yeah, well, I'm really loving all this. This is very good, I think, all these contributors. I think to answer from Niall's question, I think both can be true. That is, it can still be a matter of the Zaka, all the while you can talk about the feeling and content of one's own language. I don't see it being an either or. I do find that when he speaks about poetry, if we look closely, especially in word and image, he'll talk about actually other essays. He talks about intonation. And if you look closely at what Gadamer says, he's not just all in his head, especially when it comes to poetry. So I don't think the feeling and content is so far out of reach, adding the word feeling along with content. He does recognize that almost that the sensibility, which is a word we can also use for understanding. There's a certain sensibility in the experience of poetry. And why not use the word feeling? But then you could say there's a sensibility when I just want to talk about in a conversation with my partner, why did you act that way or whatever. It's never just a head trip. I think Gadamer should have said more about this, but I like the fact that he does say it and it makes sense. And your remarks about poetry, I think many of us know that that's spot on. And the poet under scrutiny about the untranslatability, of course, is Paul Celan. But it's also, and then the translation of poetry, as I remarked earlier, he does quote it someplace saying all translation is a betrayal, as if to say it complicates the effort of interpretation. It doubles the difficulty of interpretation.
It's just slightly different. He says Sprachgefühls. He doesn't say feeling. He says Sprachgefühls. So when you translate, you can't get the Sprachgefühl, the feeling of the language of that poem. Yeah. Not a big thing, but just a small.
Is it more like the atmosphere then? Is it more like the atmosphere of the language which is being captured by the Gefühl in that moment? It's more the Stimmung. Maybe it's the Stimmung of the language that is the target of a good translator.
Translating is hard, isn't it?
I'm sorry for interrupting. That Sprachgefühl has something to do with the correct use, with the proper use of language. It's much less atmosphere. I mean, Sprachgefühl zu haben simply means that you have a fairly deep understanding of how that language works. So in this sense, it's I don't really think that it's emotional.
So it's we would say a feeling for the language.
A feel for the language.
Yeah.
A sense for linguistic correctness,
Yeah.
so that would be, I think, an interpretive translation for that. So
Yeah.
so it's
I apologize to Lorenzo, but it's like linguistic competence,
Mhm.
yeah, okay.
where linguistic competence tells you what you can and can't say in that language, because that's just not how we would say it in English.
Yeah.
You know. I'm
Lorenzo,
sorry, Lorenzo. I apologize. I interrupted you.
Lorenzo,
Um,
I think I have your hand up.
uh, yeah, I mean, that didn't strike me as un-Gadamerian, mainly because often when Gadamer talks about translation, he talks about the necessity of the translator being in touch with what he calls the unsaid as well as the said. And the unsaid, it's going to be perhaps to some degree, what's the question to which this is a response, or what is the question to which is a response, articulated in a way that you can understand it as a question that the people who share my language will understand. So to me, it's just another version of Gadamer saying, well, the unsaid has to be attended to in a good translation as much as it's said. So it didn't strike me as being un-Gadamerian. That's
Yeah.
the short
Mm.
point. Yeah, yeah.
I think it's the sensitivity for the language is what probably
Yeah.
intended there.
Good. Say, Eddie?
Was Eddie going to say something?
Yeah, Eddie had his hand up. That's exactly what I was thinking. Did we move away
Yeah,
from say, Eddie?
but then the question shifted to translation, so I lowered my hand down. I was about to just go on slightly more on the last paragraph, because I have a sense that what he's saying feels somewhat dark and pessimistic, if I'm not mistaken. Because as he says, we always try to um reach or hit the mark seeking the correct word, but we always have the awareness that we never completely attains it. I'm not sure if that applies to each case, but if it does, then what he's saying is that, well, we always try, but like Sisyphus, we always try to hit the mark, but at the same time, we know it's never a complete success. So if that's the case, then what he's saying here is the problem is that speaking or conversational language sort of slips, and perhaps the fear is that it is our desire to reach for what we know to be impossible. And I find that a little bit troubling, that the fact that our own human existence dissipates in time and before death. Yeah, I was just not.
Right. Yes, Jim Risser.
Oh, that is such a remark. Uh, Grandin has already characterized Gadamer as a philosopher of hope. Not quite like Ricoeur, I suspect, but still a philosopher of hope. And the question of the issue of Sisyphus, let's remember, he never accomplished anything. I think what Gadamer wants to say, we accomplish a lot on the way. And that's the fundamental difference. But he also ends another essay, similar fashion, by talking about the Heraclitus and bringing the light, and as if bringing the light into the world. So he plays with this imagery of human existence, dissipates in time and before death. I mean, it's not so much a pessimism as it is just an awareness of the human condition. And the desire is interesting by itself. We've already commented on that, but I would add to it, in a therapeutic conversation will always fail if one doesn't even have a desire for the question. So there's a desire to understand, but if you don't have a desire for the question, you get nowhere. So I think the desire here is not fruitless. The desire is almost a condition of possibility for understanding, and and we do understand. So we're not Sisyphus, thankfully. That's my response to you.
Yeah, good. Karina, welcome. Thanks for joining the discussion.
Thanks, friends. I had a similar sentiment as to with Jim when I was reading that last passage. I actually didn't feel pessimistic at all. I felt like it was a reference to the finitude of understanding and the finitude of our being in this world that we can never really quite capture what we intend to mean, because we're also a movement in the world, to quote Heidegger. We move through the world, what we've already put into words solidify in the way that we can't really quite go back to, right? We're always kind of moving beyond coming into language. So I read it in a more optimistic way, and perhaps that's my approach as a clinician, is that we always try. We might never reach understanding, but we always try, reach agreement, but we always try to aim for that that ideal of understanding. I'm chewing on this idea of psychoanalysis, though I don't work as a psychoanalysis. Like, we do engage in therapeutic conversations, and I take the point about how when we chat with our clients, it is never a genuine question. Like, we are very intentional in how we question and how we might want to lead through and get to the crux of what they're trying to say. Yeah, so I'm just kind of processing what the group has said about psychoanalysis, and that it doesn't quite imitate a genuine conversation, but it also doesn't, in my perspective anyway, doesn't take us away from the task to understand, the ask to kind of understand the client before us. Perhaps maybe it's geared towards understanding client versus the subject matter that Jim talks about in Springing Up. So the intention in a psychoanalytic or a therapeutic conversation is perhaps focused on understanding the subject and less so about subject matter that Gadamer forefronts as the element of a genuine conversation.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. Eddie, has this been helpful for thinking about that last paragraph and what's going on there?
Yeah, I completely agree with Jim and with Karina there. I'm I do think we don't have to completely attain anything to make great accomplishment. I think that's what Gadamer has been re-emphasizing throughout his whole philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Abdullah, welcome. Join the conversation.
To continue the discussion of Lacan, why Gadamer appeals to Lacan here. Yes, Gadamer is highly critical about psychology in Truth and Method, right? But Lacan is a very different case here, right? Lacan thinks psychoanalysis should be demedicalized, and it should or it must introduce other disciplines to psychoanalysis, like literature, philosophy, art, and sciences. So Lacan's psychology for Gadamer is not a psychologism as should be criticized in Husserl and also Gadamer. Quite the contrary, Lacan likes the dark side of consciousness, the unsaid, or the finitude of language. That's why I believe Gadamer appeals to the other disciplines like psychoanalysis. So that's why I believe Gadamer repays Lacan's gratitude to art and literature and language, of course, by accepting Lacan to hermeneutics. So this is a kind of crossing boundaries, also extending the sphere of hermeneutics. That's the way I read this last paragraph, because this is the 4 years later after Lacan died. Maybe just a tribute.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, nice point. All right, Don Marshall.
Very well said, Abdullah. I agree with that. I did want to take up Eddie's tone. Okay, I guess I should say. And that is, there were a couple of places that I found disquieting and surprising and a little kind of alarmingly intrusive in the essay. One of them is on page 11 when he talks about evolution. And he's obviously thinking about people who want to explain language by evolution somehow. And it says, no, 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 that's not going to work. And epistemology can't be explained by evolution. But he mentions along the way that our adaptability that makes us able to survive in all kinds of circumstances could kill us. I mean, it's a remarkable thing to say. I mean, we could be the very thing that makes us human and that we've evolved into could be fatal to us. Okay, and he comes back a little bit on page 15 when he talks about the Industrial Revolution and says the Industrial Revolution grinds down grammar, and it sort of rigidifies diction, and so the computers kind of control diction, and it seemed to me to come back when he's talking about the statement. Well, he says the Western fascination with the statement among all the possibilities of speaking is very productive for the sciences. Okay, but it's also very dangerous. I mean, it seems to make it. I think the point he's making is linguisticality is not simply automatically inscribed in the world and in human beings. We could destroy the very thing that makes us human, as Aristotle puts it, that is our linguisticality. If we reduce it to statements, if we give up the dialogical approach, the search for connectedness in it, the solidarity that comes with it. So I thought, wow, this is really a very alarming line of thought that's sort of deeply underneath the essay.
Great. Jim.
Don, that was a really insightful addition to the conversation. I thank you for it. Two comments to maybe reaffirm it or expand it. One is we see in Gadamer's works always about this technologization. He's not against it, technologization and all that that implies in all of its fields, but how it moves away from human company. And that's that Miteinander that he talks about in the essay that follows this one in the book. And that for Gadamer, that's part of Gadamer's humanism. But the other aspect of it is when you first started saying something, your remarks, Don, I thought of that passage from Antigone about the one that Heidegger picks up about this creature being the most strange, Dinon. And it's this ability, the Greeks don't say it this way, for the technologization that we can manipulate everything that we bring into the world. But, there's going to be why is that dangerous? Why is that such a strange thing and perhaps dangerous thing? Is, well, you give all kinds of reasons for it, but it's something to attend to of just seeing this course of the world by which we bring it under our own power. And all the effects and side effects of that experience. And Gadamer, the experience of understanding for Gadamer is about the experience of human living. So it's so rich in thought. Thank you for it.
Yeah.
Can I just add one point? And that is when he's talking about the child, he says that children make wonderful abstractions. Okay. And these are wonderful abstractions that are not part of the standard language. Okay, but he talks about his daughter and so forth. And he says they do this because they play with language. And they can attain the abstractions that regular language has, but we pay, he says, a terrible price for our socialization. And I thought, wow. He even says it's almost comic. He sort of says, despite the fact that we talk High German to children, they still learn German. And you think, what is he saying? Okay, it's just a sense that there's a great that linguisticality is beset by various dangers and alarming kinds of features, I think.
Can I just say that I was thinking during the conversation, there is this in Gesamtausgabe 55, Heidegger's lecture on Heraclitus. He says that the dictionary is the tomb of language, and he says it buries the Sprachschatz. He says the treasure that is language. And I think there's something similar going on in the proposition or the classification of language as a system of rules, that there's something in the treasure of language that gets lost that the child has access to. So, and I was thinking also of Heraclitus, who says the kingdom is the child. You know, that Heraclitus fragment, right? There is something about the play, the child at play, which has access to the treasure, which gets lost in the formulation of rules and regulations that we understand language by way of. So I think that might be something in the background for Gadamer too. Sprachschatz.
Sure. John Beach.
Yes, this is in concerning our pessimism and our killing ourselves and so on, and also in the introduction to metaphysics, the Dinon and Antigone is or man is the strangest animal, so the dinos and so on, and in Truth and Method 323, and at the end of the Relevance of Aristotle, he talks about the dinos. He says, referring to Aristotle's in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says that he describes a naturally debased version of this moral knowledge, and he said that the dinos is a man who has all the natural prerequisites and gifts for this moral knowledge, a man who is able with remarkable skill to get the most out of any situation, is able to turn everything to his advantage, familiar, and finds a way out of every situation. But this natural counterpart to phronesis is characterized by the fact that the dinos is capable of anything. He uses his skills to any purpose and is without inhibition. He is anu aretes. And it is more than accidental that such a person is given the name that also means terrible or terrifying. Nothing is so terrible, so uncanny, so appealing as the exercise of brilliant talents for evil. Of course, this is Donald Trump. But the thing is, this is Gadamer really criticizing Heidegger in that, almost glorification of this uncanniness and this sort of wild nature of man. And I think it's a very very useful passage. It also tells us what to expect if Donald Trump gets reelected. Yeah. But Gadamer is I think it's a real critique of Heidegger here.
Yeah, thanks, John. So Lorenzo, at the beginning, you brought up you want to make sure we talked about linguistic competency and what Gadamer has to say about that. Do you feel like that's been addressed yet, or should we return to that now? Or so?
Only in this sense, and it may be a fairly minor technical issue, but when Gadamer talks about linguistic competence in that penultimate paragraph, he's making a reference to the way in which that concept is used by linguistic researchers, by linguists. And he doesn't have it quite right there. He talks about linguists augmenting rule systems, linguistic rule systems, syntax and semantics, I guess, with a concept of linguistic competence. But that's not quite the way it worked, at least for Chomsky. I mean, the idea was that you appeal to competent speakers, the speakers who you presume have linguistic competence, which basically is the competence to produce, say, well-formed sentences in a given language. And you, by kind of a rational reconstruction, you tease out the rules of the language based upon the choices that persons with linguistic competence make. And so linguistic competence is a touchstone for the determination of the rules that govern the language, say that in the way, say for Chomsky and for linguists. So I think Gadamer has that kind of backwards. So I'm thinking that maybe he doesn't really mean linguistic competence as a technical term in the way which linguists use it, but something else. I'm thinking, well, maybe he means something like what Habermas referred to as communicative competence. Communicative competence is the ability to produce or use or exchange various forms of performatives, let's say, in a certain sort of context. So knowing how to know, it has to do with knowing how to communicate as opposed to knowing how to produce well-formed sentences, which is linguistic competence. So I think that's sort of a technical thing. He doesn't really mean linguistic competence, he means something else. And then actually, I think what he's really getting at is when he says that language is not just a matter of following rules, but something else. And then it seems to me what it's really getting at is the kind of the whole Aristotelian notion of phronesis or judgment, that we're not talking about rule following, we're really talking about judgment. So I think that's what's really going on there, but it gets muddled because I think he's not really using the term as it gets used by the people he's talking about. Like that's all I want to say.
Yeah. I think that's what's going on there too. It's his usual comment about rules.
Yeah.
Practical wisdom, know how to apply the rules, and
Mhm.
so it can't just simply be about rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was helpful.
Yeah. Thanks.
Are there other things that people were hoping we would get to that we haven't yet? Yes, Niall.
I had something maybe potentially selfish in terms of my own interest, but on page 16, I was once told by a phenomenologist that not everyone loves your children like you love your children. So, but this is my an interest here at the moment is at the end of the first full paragraph on page 16. He refers to Augustine, and he talks about this inner conversation. And Jim made reference earlier to the inner word. I was wondering how we might try to make sense of that distinction between speaking with others and speaking with oneself as another, and what kind of otherness is at stake, and how would you distinguish the otherness that's in my inner conversation, which is thinking, and then the reaching the other when it comes to speaking well, hitting the mark. What kind of otherness is involved when it comes to those two different types of speaking? Jim, I know, Jim, in the past you said that I don't think you see that as such a tension in Gadamer, but those references to the soul's dialogue with itself, they're few and far between in Gadamer. And he just simply always mentions what Plato called thinking. And then he moves on to talk about conversations with the other, the coming to an agreement with other people. But what is the coming to an agreement with oneself, and how would that be different?
I have it there. Yes, Andrew, go ahead. Andrew.
Yeah, I'm not sure how relevant it is, but Augustine was really taken aback by Ambrose because Ambrose would read out loud to himself. And I guess it could be interpreted as talking to himself, but only verbally out loud. So I'm not sure to what extent Augustine actually spoke to himself internally. You could look at it that way. I'm not sure, but this may be relevant, this Ambrose context. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Joseph, you want to get in on this?
A quick clarification. I think Augustine was impressed by Ambrose because he read quietly instead of reading out loud, if I'm not mistaken. So it was the other way around.
Yeah, so pardon me, that was just it. Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for the correction there. That's it.
Okay. And Jim, did you want to apply to? Yeah. Go ahead, Jim.
I wanted to try to. Again, sometimes you people ask tough questions here. It is interesting, though, that when Gadamer does talk about the experience of understanding, he always links it to a self-understanding. And we know that's not an insulation. It's about a relationship to the world. That is, I'm not simply within my own self when I have that self-understanding. What's the difference between the conversation of the soul with oneself, which is an experience with otherness, I'm absolutely convinced of that. Because otherwise there'd be pure identity. And so in my own self-reflection, if there's not an experience of otherness, I'm not even, I don't even reflect because identity would overwhelm me. Maybe it's a double otherness in the sense that I'm always dealing with the question from the other that becomes my question. And why I'm stumbling here is, do I wind up separating myself then from that response to the other than I am in my own self-reflection? I'm not so sure. Maybe we do always keep a certain space open about that. But it's a complex thing that you just brought up, and I'd have to think more about it. So I welcome further comments.
Okay. Csaba.
Very, very briefly, I think that, and in this respect, I do disagree with what James Risser just said. I think that there is no such alterity in my own dialogue with myself as in a real dialogue with someone else, because it's simply always in the framework of my expectations, my presuppositions that I approach problems that perhaps others posed and formulated, and it is the happening of confronting, encountering a strange impulse from the outside, which can occur in a real dialogue, but it doesn't seem to make sense in my inner dialogue. So I'm talking to myself. I developing my ideas in myself. It's unclear where such an authority could come from. So I would opt for the treatment. I would opt for understanding this formula of Gadamer as myself as another as an overstatement. There is in certain sense no possibility to treat myself as another. So the famous title "Soi-même comme un autre" in Ricoeur, that's a different issue. I would say.
Wait, now, did you want to get back in there because you put this on the table?
I think practically we do that all the time, though. Just factually, we do it all the time. We speak to ourselves in the first person, and then you can also speak to yourself in the second person, right? You can actually chastise yourself, and then in the next moment you can say, well, maybe I should be more of a friend to myself, and I treat me like a you. How I treat myself as I would have treated another. So thinking or even speaking can be self-othering, right? It can be self-solicitude, to modify Heidegger. So you could have the solicitude of relating to another and the self-solicitude of speaking to myself. In Aristotelian language, of being a friend to oneself before one can be a friend to another, and then needing others so that I can be a friend to myself. So there's the dialectic that they're distinguishable, at least they're distinguishable experiences.
Yeah, yes, of course, you can have an internal protagonist or counterpart, but that's your own creature to some extent. I mean, this also Hannah Arendt has this idea of an inner dialogue partner who asks me to justify what I'm doing, and so on and so on. That's possible. What is not possible is failing understanding in what you are doing. So those disruption of expectations and presuppositions that happen when you understand or try to understand a foreign perspective. You won't have a foreign perspective within yourself. I think that's the point. That's a crucial point. But
I disagree strongly.
Okay.
What could stay this title of a book? We are strangers to ourselves. I could say it another way. In fact, Niall, I think you talk about the experience of conscience that Heidegger will write about, where you have closer to a self-reference, certainly than anything Gadamer will want to say. And that is for Heidegger, it's not the Freudian superego when he talks about conscience, but it is he even will describe it. He says it just in a passing phrase. It's the voice of a friend, but it's an uncanny voice that comes. You can't even identify where it's coming from. It comes from nowhere, from no one and from nowhere, and yet conscience seems to be an internal mechanism. So I think there is this. We could go on about this. I would like to. I think we do have an experience of foreignness within ourselves. And even when I speak to myself in a self-reflective conversation, that's the world is speaking to me. It's myself in the world because I don't have my thoughts just internally, isolated from the world. So it's the world speaking to me when I have a self-reflective moment or a question.
There is a moment in Gadamer in which, and very few and far between, but he says, when I fail to understand on some level, I fail to get on with myself. And that seems very different. It's not about hitting the other. It's not about, there's a type of otherness that I'm not accessing when I don't understand. But he talks about failing, not getting on with oneself, which I think is really a very interesting tension in his philosophy, because I don't think he explores that breakdown of understanding in the self-relationality. Because even self-understanding, Jim, as you said, it's really about being kind of ferried away by understanding, by the world of meaning. It's being kind of cast and caught by the world, and not really about this self-relation so much, where self-relation usually means self-apprehension, self-grasping, self-relation, self-directionality in a very apprehending sense, I guess, the term he's most allergic to. Anyway.
Good. Are there other topics? We have a couple minutes left here.
Well, I'll mention when it's too late to raise it into the discussion, but on the very first page, in that last paragraph, he says, right at the outset, I would like to make a remark that in a certain sense already indicates language has its boundaries, namely writing. So the argument here is that the fact that there is such a thing as writing is a proof for him that language has its boundaries. And exactly how that works, because I think that is connected with what comes at the end, the statement. I always think of the statement as recorded somehow in writing or electronically, something like that, and hence decontextualized. Okay. And he talks about writing as able to prescribe or transcribe language. Okay. So all of those themes are very rich and very complicated, and I don't, I can just beginning to think about them.
Good, thanks. I want to say I was surprised by the argument on page 11, which is an argument you hear other people make, that he argues that our ability to know can't simply be reduced to evolutionary pressures. He says, then it could merely be adaptive, and then we can no longer justify knowledge. As he says, we would no longer guarantee it has anything to say about the being of things and the question of truth. So I was surprised to hear that argument come from him. Say, if we're really talking about knowledge, it has to be about the being of things and the question of truth. It can't simply be about what works, what functions, what helps us to interact and engage and communicate. So that was one little thing that surprised me in the context of this talk about evolution. So any final thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's been a while. It's good to be back. We'll be meeting again in 2 months in December, mid-December. I put in the chat some events that are happening in the next year, both NAS next fall, and then if you want to go see Andrew, come to San Francisco. Andrew's going to be presenting at the Pacific APA on. Andrew, you want to say what your title is? If you remember, do you have it on top of your head?
Well, I'm still working on it, but it's basically I'm taking on Roger T. Alms as a sinologist.
Yeah.
And so my argument is that he can't properly, he weds his translations to a political program because he doesn't properly understand Confucianism, which has to be situated in the context of religious transformation of Taoism and Buddhism. And that comes in through Chung-Ying Cheng. So it's a sinologist versus what I call an existentialist prone Chinese philosopher, Roger T. Alms and Chung-Ying Cheng.
Yep.
That's it so far.
Chung-Ying Cheng just recently passed away, right?
He did. That's right.
One of the motivations for the session.
Oh,
so
really? Andrew, I didn't know that he passed away.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, in August.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it was due to, I'm sorry you didn't know that, Jim, but yeah, he passed away, I think, because of COVID. He caught it either at a conference or in hospital, unfortunately. So it happened rather suddenly. And this is why he was, really active right to the last day, even published in 2024 this year, an interesting article on Quine. Concludes with some reflections on quantum physics.
Yeah, that's too bad. I'm so sorry to hear that.
It is unfortunate. Yeah,
definitely.
definitely.
If you don't know his work, people, it's worth a look.
Yeah, he's left such a great legacy, so many publications and I think brought Chinese philosophy into the fore, globally, I would say. So he's certainly remarkable and we've got all of his wonderful work to study.
Right. Onto hermeneutics, isn't that sort of this?
That's part of it. Yeah, that's part of it. Definitely. Yeah.
Please say the name again.
Well, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I'd say just Chung-Ying Chen. Chung-Ying Chen.
I think it's Chung.
Yes.
I
G, not with an E at the end.
Yeah, Chen.
And incidentally, he had met Gadamer, and he loved to talk about him meeting Gadamer in a couple conversations I had with him. So a very remarkable man that did a lot to show the connection between Gadamer and Chinese thought. Yes.
Yeah. And Grandine's book looks really fascinating as well on metaphysics and hermeneutics. So thanks so much for mentioning that. I'm just about to order it.
You don't need to order it.
Hey, pardon me?
You don't need to order it. It turns out that Grandin has worked something so that they've paid the publisher Bloomsbury to provide it as open access.
Really?
Oh, I mean,
wow.
You order it, you can have your own hard copy for $100 and some, or you can simply download it for free through the publisher site.
Paper copy is around $60 apparently. But yeah, that's great. Well, it's wonderful you did that. That's amazing.
So, all right. So thanks everybody. Take care. Thanks for joining us.
Okay.
Thanks for the organization.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.